Hi, folks. Okay, I'm going to give you a video here talking about the 1967 Goldman paper, where he gives you a causal theory of knowing. The main thing I want to do here is cover the basic idea of the theory of knowledge he gives, and try to give my own explanation of some of his examples. He's got diagrams, and normally I think diagrams make everything clear, but I think his might just be kind of extra confusing. So I'm going to give you some of my own. Okay, let's get the basic idea. First of all, the kind of thing that Goldman is trying to do here is to avert Gettier's problem. So he wants to give you a revision of the justified true belief analysis, which he, like Gettier, is considering the traditional analysis. So a revision of that analysis that won't be vulnerable to the kind of counterexamples that Gettier gives. Okay, so the kind of examples Gettier gives are examples of justified true belief that isn't knowledge. So he starts, for example, by saying, Goldman starts by going over again one of Gettier's examples, this example where you've got somebody who believes that Jones owns a Ford, maybe is justified in believing that, it turns out to be false, but because this person, Smith, believes that Jones owns a Ford, he comes to believe by a competent inference, he comes up with an argument that's a good argument. The conclusion of the argument is either Jones owns a Ford or Brown is in Barcelona. Seeing that Q entails P, Smith infers that P is true. So because Smith believes this thing, he comes to believe this thing. Gettier says, and Goldman agrees, that means he's justified in believing P, at least in this article. Goldman is willing to agree that he's justified in believing P. As it turns out, P is true. But the reason P is true isn't that Jones owns a Ford. The reason is that Brown is in Barcelona. But Smith had no idea about that. So it looks like we have a justified true belief, but not knowledge. Okay. So Goldman briefly mentions this guy, Michael Clark, who obviously doesn't know how to spell Clark. Clark is the person we typically cite for the no false premises response to Gettier's problem that we've talked about in class. Right? The no false premises revision of the JTB theory says, okay, in order to have knowledge, you need not just a justified true belief, but your justification for that belief must not rely on an inference from a false premise. And that certainly captures this case, right? How does Smith come to believe P here? He comes to believe it by inference from Q. So Q is a premise in an argument where P is the conclusion. But although Smith was justified in believing Q, Q is in fact false. So we can deal with this sort of case. Okay, I have suggested in class that there are other kinds of, we can come up with Gettier examples, that is, cases of justified true belief without knowledge, that where the belief in question isn't inferred from anything at all. In which case, this revision of the JTB analysis, Clark's revision, where he adds in a no false premises condition, isn't going to be able to deal with those. So if you have a justified true belief that isn't inferred from anything, then in particular, it isn't inferred from anything false. And if we can come up with examples like that, then the theory doesn't solve the problem it needed to solve. Okay, there may be other problems for the theory as well. I've hinted at that too. You might, anyway, I'm not here to talk about that. Okay, I just want you to know, Michael Clark, when you should connect that name and this paragraph and the other cases where Goldman talks about Clark's revision of the JTB analysis later in this paper. You should connect that with the discussion that we had in each of the tutorials we have talked about on no false premises or no false lemmas revision of the theory. Now, in a nutshell, what's Goldman's idea instead? Goldman says, notice that what makes P true is the fact that Brown is in Barcelona, but that this fact has nothing to do with Smith's believing P. That is, there's no causal connection between the fact that Brown is in Barcelona and Smith's believing P. So Brown being in Barcelona is the thing that makes P true, but there's no causal connection between the fact that makes the belief true and Smith's having that belief. If Smith had come to believe P by reading a letter from Brown postmarked in Barcelona, then we might say that Smith knew P. Maybe that counts as an appropriate causal connection. Alternatively, if Jones did own a Ford, and his owning Ford was manifested by his offer of a ride to Smith, which was supposed to be part of Smith's evidence or his reasons, his justification for believing that Jones owns a Ford, And this in turn resulted in Smith's believing P. Then we would say that Smith knew P. Thus, one thing that seems to be missing in this example is a causal connection between the fact that makes P true, or simply the fact that P, and Smith's belief of P. The requirement of such a causal connection is what I wish to add to the traditional analysis. Okay. As Goldman goes on to give the theory in more and more detail and explore different sorts of examples, he's going to say, look, there are lots of different ways that like a belief could have an appropriate causal connection to the facts that make it true. There are different shapes that an appropriate causal connection can different shapes that kind of connection can take. So what I want to do in the rest of this video is try to explain, in my own words, the kind of examples that he gives in sort of increasing complexity. We are going to get onto examples involving a news story. That's going to be like our most complicated example. But just to give us an example that we can start with, here I know that like things in the States and the UK and Europe are sort of all over the news, but here's a little bit of news from my home province in Canada. Things happen to us too, Canadians. The CBC reports that a Chatham woman scored 365 points on a single word in Scrabble. Here she is, Betty Kuchta. There she is, very happy. There's her Scrabble thing. So I want to take a concrete example. We will get onto a concrete example of something that you might come to believe by means of reading this. The kind of example I want is something that the reporter who wrote this observed and relayed to you. So suppose you read this article that's written by CBC News, I guess by a general agency. But so here's something that the reporter observed, okay? Something that Betty Kuchta said. She said these things that are in quotation marks. She said, I just went, wow, and so did my husband, Stephen. Wow. And we thought maybe this is some kind of a record. Okay, the reporter's not telling you this is a record. They're telling you that Betty Kuchta said these words. Okay, you might, on the basis of reading this article, come to know, we might think, that Betty Kuchta said those things. I'm going to get onto that case. That's going to be our most complicated case, where you come to know something by reading about it, reading somebody's report, in this case, a newspaper. But let's start with something more direct. So here's one way, very direct and simple way that you can have an appropriate causal connection between your belief about something and the fact that the thing is true. You might directly perceive that it's true. Okay, so Goldman suggests that we conceive of perception as, let's call this sensory perception, as a way that beliefs can be directly caused by the corresponding facts in the world. So depending on the kind of perception involved, so like I believe that there is a fingerless glove that I knit. I just learned to knit in the last month. It's delightful. I perceive that this thing is here. I point my eyes at it, and I, certain impressions are formed of a certain patch of color, and like maybe some memories are triggered or something like that. And that just like causes me to believe, that sort of directly puts the belief in my head that there is this thing in front of me. Okay, what's another example of that? We might think of the relationship between the reporter who listened to Betty Kuchta saying these words. So the reporter directly listened to Betty Kuchta saying those words, certain like sound waves hit them in the ear holes. And then they came to, that just caused beliefs in their head. A belief, not that this was a record, but that Betty Kuchta said these words. Okay, so if we can draw that in a diagram, we might see something like this. So I'm using the solid arrow here. This solid arrow, this is supposed to symbolize causation. So here's my clip art of a reporter. They have a thought bubble. They have the belief of, here's our picture of Betty Kuchta being delighted by her Scrabble score. Because this person directly observed, because of the fact that Betty Kuchta said these things, let's imagine this is a picture of her saying these things. Because of that, the reporter comes to think that Betty Kuchta said these words. Okay, the fact that she said the things is causing your belief about the same thing. In this case, you are the reporter. That counts as an appropriate causal connection. Your belief is caused by the fact that it's about, and your belief is true. And let's also say it's justified. Maybe that doesn't, when we're talking about direct causation by perception, we don't have to ask about causation. That's enough. That counts as an appropriate causal connection. Okay, that's the simplest case, most direct. Your belief that P is caused by the fact that P. What kind of causation? Perception. Okay, let's do a more complicated case. Goldman talks about a case where you are walking around on some mountains and you see a certain kind of rock, and you know some stuff about rocks. You know that this kind of rock is formed by volcanic eruptions. And so, from this observation of the rocks, you come to believe correctly that a volcano erupted here at some point in the past and formed these rocks. Goldman wants to say this is a case of knowledge, but look, your belief that a volcano erupted here in the past, that's not caused directly by the volcano erupting, right? You didn't observe that. What might that look like? Okay, let me give you a different diagram. This is a little bit simpler than Goldman's diagram. So this time I have two different kinds of arrows here. I have a solid arrow for causation, arrow from cause to effect, indicates that one thing causes the other. Then I'm going to have these dashed arrows that I have drawn very poorly. And this is supposed to symbolize or to represent either inference or reasoning, right? Something that goes not from cause to effect, but from premise to conclusion. Okay, first let me tell you what Goldman thinks is the right picture of what's happening in this volcanic rock case, and then I'll tell you why he thinks this is good. So here's the picture. The causal picture is at some point in the past, this volcano erupted. Because of that, you wind up with a certain kind of rock. Let's connect this with the other story. Here's a useful word in Scrabble, a two-letter word. Those are useful to know. Spelled A-A. It's a Hawaiian word. I learned this from LeVar Burton on Reading Rainbow when I was a child. I don't know any other words for rocks, but I still remember LeVar Burton picking up some samples of and saying, oh, it's sharp. They're sharp ones. They have tiny little holes. They seem cool. Anyway, so here's what happens in real life out in the world. This has nothing to do with anybody believing anything. At some point, a volcano erupts. Because of that, as an effect of that, there winds up being this certain kind of rock in a certain place. Okay, then a person comes along. Here's a drawing of a person. A person comes along, points his eyeballs at the rocks, and sees, this is this is somebody who recognizes rocks, looks at the rocks again by that same perceptual process, just like with our news reporter before. By pointing their senses at these rocks, they are thereby caused. Here's a causal arrow again. It's solid. They are caused to have this belief. Okay, so this person knows that there's here because their belief that there is here is caused by the fact that there is here. Okay, so this is knowledge. If we just look at the picture of the and this picture of the person believing that there's there, then everything is as simple as in the previous diagram. But now the thing we need to explain is how is this person comes to know, why do they count as knowing that the volcano erupted? Well, Goldman says this person, maybe by means of, some other, with the help of some other premises, some other beliefs that they have, maybe some stuff they know, not about this particular sample of rock here, but about this kind of rock in general, by means of, with assistance from these other beliefs, this person infers from the first belief, the belief that there's here. They come to believe, they form the belief that a volcano erupted here at some point in the past. Now, this second belief, the belief that a volcano erupted here in the past, that counts as knowledge because it's inferred from this other belief that is appropriately causally connected to the thing that it's about. And this pattern of inference, this dashed arrow here, taking you from one belief to the next, mirrors the causal picture out in the world. So you are inferring from this belief to that belief. The belief that's the premise in your premise conclusion inference is the effect of the thing that's the conclusion. So this arrow, this dashed arrow here mirrors the solid arrow over there. Okay. That counts as an appropriate causal connection between this belief and the fact that it's about. So this belief counts as knowledge. Okay, let's make things a little bit more complicated. Let's look at the case where, so we had the case where the news reporter knows that Betty Kuchta said certain things because of this direct causal connection between the fact and the belief. What about you when you read on cbc.ca that Betty Kuchta did a good Scrabble? Here's my more complicated picture. Let's go through this step by step. Notice again, we have both solid causal arrows, 3 of those, and we have some dashed inference arrows. We have 2 people involved. We have the news reporter, and we have you, or let's say me, reading the news report. So I'm going to give you the complete picture. So Betty Kuchta says certain things. She makes sounds with her mouth. As a result of that, that causes this news reporter to have certain beliefs. This is a thought bubble here. This news reporter comes to believe that Betty Kuchta said certain things. Because the reporter believes those things, the news reporter says those things or writes those things. Because the news reporter says those things or writes those things, you are caused to believe that the news reporter said those things, because the thing you observe directly is the news reporter saying the thing. So you come to believe that the news reporter said those things. You think to yourself, maybe not even explicitly, you think the news reporter said these things because the news reporter thinks so. The news reporter is being a news reporter. They're speaking sincerely. And so you come to believe that the news reporter believes that Betty Kuchta said this stuff. And then you think, oh, the news reporter probably did their research well. They wouldn't have come to believe that Betty Kuchta said this stuff unless they observed Betty Kuchta saying these things. And so because you believe that the news reporter believes this thing, you come to believe that the thing happened. Okay, we have the 2 conditions that we had a second ago for the volcano case are going to hold here for this counting as knowledge. So in the volcano case, we said there were 2 things we asked for. Number 1, I asked for, there's got to at some point be this kind of direct causal connection. The fact that something causes your belief that that thing is true. And then the inferential picture, the inferential arrows, the dashed arrows that take you from that belief that was caused by the thing it's about, that take you from that belief to the belief in question, mirror the causal arrows taking you from the cause of something to the thing that you wound up believing. Okay. We have the same thing here. So right in the center of the picture, we have a causal arrow taking us directly from this fact to your belief about the same fact. And then we have the dashed arrows, the inferential arrows mirror the causal arrows outside of that. So these 2 causal arrows are mirrored by these 2 inferential arrows, right? So here you directly come to believe that the reporter said this thing because you observed the reporter saying the thing. You believe that the reporter thought the thing because you infer that the reporter thought the thing because they said the thing. And in fact, they said the thing because they thought the thing. You believe that the thing is true. You infer that from your belief that the reporter thought the thing. And indeed, the reporter thought the thing because the thing was true. Maybe that was confusing because I kept saying the thing. You believe that the reporter said Betty Kuchta said, she said, wow. You believe that the reporter said that Betty Kuchta said, wow. Let's just keep it that simple. Because, in fact, that was true. The reporter said that Betty Kuchta said, wow. You infer from your belief that the reporter said Betty Kuchta said, wow. You infer from that a new belief that the reporter thinks Betty Kuchta said, wow. The reporter believes Betty Kuchta said, wow. And indeed, the reporter said Betty Kuchta said, wow, because the reporter believes Betty Kuchta said, wow. You infer from your belief that the reporter thinks Betty Kuchta said, wow, that Betty Kuchta said, wow. And indeed, the reporter does think that Betty Kuchta said, wow, because she said, wow. Okay, that's the causal picture. I'm going to stop there. Once I figure out how to stop the recording, see you soon.